Good morning, Nuggets. This lesson covers identifying and revising phrase and subordinate clause sentence fragments. Before you watch this video, you should probably review or watch the video on telling the difference between phrases and clauses. In this lesson, you're going to learn how to identify phrase fragments, identify subordinate clause fragments, revise phrase fragments, revise subordinate clause fragments, and briefly, I will introduce how to use commas to punctuate introductory or interrupting subordinate clauses and also phrases in some cases. We aren't going to go very far with this because we will do commas in another grammar unit. Let's get started. First, understanding phrases and clauses can help you identify sentence fragments, and I'm going to show you how. But before we proceed, we should probably define the word sentence fragments. Have you heard this one before? I'm sure many of you have heard it, but for those of you who haven't, let's review. Sentence fragment. It is a wolf in sheep's clothing. It is a group of words pretending to be a sentence, but it can't actually stand on its own. So it might be capitalized, it might have punctuation, it might have many different parts of speech, but for one reason or another, it's an imposter. It can't actually exist without something else to help it make sense. So it could be missing any one of four items. It could be missing a subject. It could be missing a predicate. It could be missing both. Or it could have everything that it's supposed to have. A capital letter, punctuation, a subject, and a predicate. But it could still not express a complete thought. And you should realize that that is a clause, and we'll be talking about those. But let's start with phrases. You should know already that phrases are always fragments when they stand alone, and that's because they never have both a subject and a predicate at the same time, and sometimes they don't have both. So let's look at some examples. So here's one, playing with Shay's brother. Well, I have a verb, playing, and I also have a noun. I have Shay and I have brother. So at first I might think, oh, well, I have a subject and a predicate. I'm good. This is actually a clause, not a phrase. But you would be wrong. Because the problem is playing with Shay's brother. See this word with? We're talking about who is being played with. We're not talking about who is playing with Shay's brother. So I don't know who's doing the playing. I'm missing a subject, which makes this a phrase fragment. Another example, you're missing test. At first when I see this, I see test, I see missing. Now missing ends in ing, so at first I might think that's a verb, but it's not. Notice that it's before the noun and it's describing the noun. So in this context, missing is actually an adjective describing test. So basically I have a noun phrase, but I have no verb to go with it. I'm missing a predicate. I'm not saying anything about the missing test at all, and it's not doing anything. So again, I have another phrase fragment. Last but not least, and you'll see these very rarely, hopefully, always amazingly beautiful. I don't even have a noun in here. I have adverbs and I have adjectives. I'm missing both here, and again, this is a phrase fragment. But fragments aren't always phrases. Sometimes they can be clauses. So it's important that you realize clauses may or may not be fragments. Remember, independent clauses, they can stand alone as sentences. They're fine. They don't need anything else. But dependent, also known as subordinate clauses, they can't. They need to rely on another complete thought in order to make sense, or your reader or whoever is listening to you gets lost. So here's one example, that the princess wanted. We have a subject, princess. We have a predicate, wanted. But this word right here makes this confusing, that. I have a subordinate clause fragment. Another example, I have a subject, I have a verb, was. Because I was up until 3 a.m. Well, because I was up, what happened? This is an incomplete thought because I have because, which is a subordinating conjunction. Again, It's another subordinate clause fragment. Last example, when we got to Grandma's house at 8 p.m. Well, I have a subject, we. I have a predicate, got to Grandma's house at 8 p.m. But I've added a subordinating conjunction. I've added when. And when I say that to you, when we got to Grandma's house at 8 p.m., if you're listening to me, you're lost. You're like, well, what happened when you got there? You need to finish the thought, and so you need to add something to it. Otherwise, this is, again, a subordinate clause fragment. Let's test how good you are. So let's practice skills. Identify whether each item in the paragraph below is a phrase fragment, a subordinate clause, or an independent clause. So in your notes, number 1 through 7. You don't have to skip lines. And then as I read the paragraph, just write down the letter for what you think that particular word group is. So if you believe that it is a phrase fragment, you'll write down the letter P next to the number. If you think it's a subordinate clause, you'll write down SC next to the number. And if you think it's a complete sentence or an independent clause, you'll write down IC. Number 1. Members of my family pursue interesting hobbies, enjoy collecting old books, and growing rare flowers and knitting hot pads. My favorite Uncle Raymond, who writes and performs country music, carries his tape recorders everywhere. Because he thinks he might be discovered, the family often asks Raymond to perform. Now, as you can see, there are several fragments here. Pause this video and see if you can identify them all. Remember, you only have to write the letter next to the number. Do not write the sentence. Pause and then hit play when you're ready to resume. Welcome back. Let's check your answers. First of all, look at number 2 and at number 3 and at number 5. Next to 2, 3, and 5, you should have a letter P because these are phrase fragments. Number 2 is a phrase fragment because you only have verbs. You're missing a subject. You're not saying who is enjoying collecting old books, even though it was implied in the previous sentence. For number 3, this is a phrase because you only have a subject, my favorite Uncle Raymond. You don't have a predicate. You're not saying my favorite is Uncle Raymond. You're not saying my favorite uncle is Raymond. You're missing a verb. There's no predicate. So this is a phrase fragment. And number 5 is also a phrase fragment because it's not saying who carries his tape recorders everywhere. You're missing a subject. Now look at number 4 and at number 6. Number 4 and number 6 are both subordinate clause fragments because they each have subjects and predicates, yet they don't express complete thoughts. So when you look at number 4, we have who writes and performs. So who is the subject, writes, and performs. Those are both verbs in our predicate. We have a subject and predicate, but this is clearly an incomplete thought. We're not asking a question here. That's not the intention. So even though in the previous sentence we named a person, we don't have that subject in this sentence. Number 6 is a subordinate clause fragment because of the subordinating conjunction, because. I do have a subject, he, and I do have a verb, thinks. I actually have 2. I have he thinks, and I also have he might be discovered. But again, this word right here makes it a dependent clause. So that means next to 1 and 7, you should have the letters IC for a complete sentence. Members of my family pursue interesting hobbies. So our subject is members. What are they doing? They're pursuing interesting hobbies. It's capitalized, it's punctuated, expresses a complete thought. It is an independent clause or a sentence. Number 7, the family often asks Raymond to perform. The family is the subject. What's the family doing? They often ask Raymond to perform. Subject, predicate, complete thought. Bam. Sentence is good to go. Now, of course, in real life, no one's going to walk up to you and say, hey, is this a phrase or an independent clause? No one's going to ask you that, okay? But you have to be able to identify them in order to be able to fix them. And your employers, your future professors, people that you come into contact with are going to expect you to be able to proofread and revise your work. So let's learn how to fix them. We're going to start by looking at how to fix phrase fragments, and there are 3 methods. The first method is to develop a complete sentence by adding whatever the phrase is missing. So if it's missing a subject, you add a subject. If it's missing a predicate, you add a predicate. If it's missing both, then you add both. Think of this like tasting chicken noodle soup, and you taste it and you realize it needs more salt. So you tasted it so that you know what it needs, and then you add what it needs. So here's an example. Playing with Shay's brother. You'll remember this example from a previous slide. So we've already established that it is a phrase fragment. So what could I add to this to fix it? Well, it's missing a subject, so I'm going to add a subject. My new and improved sentence, I added a subject. Sanja was playing with Shay's brother. So I've identified who's doing the playing. Notice I added a helping verb here, was. Often when you correct phrase fragments or subordinate clause fragments, you might have to do that in order to make your sentence sound grammatically correct or to preserve your verb tense. We're still on the same method, but let's look at a different type of phrase fragment. So we said previously this fragment was missing a predicate. So we add a predicate and voila. What about the missing test? Your missing test is lowering your grade. So now I've completed the thought by adding the predicate. Last example, always amazingly beautiful. These types of phrase fragments are a little bit more difficult because they're missing more information. So we're missing both a subject and a predicate, so I have to add both. So I've added a new subject, Rhoda, and what's she doing? She looks amazingly beautiful. Pardon my typo here. See? Even when you proofread, you can still miss things. Let that be a lesson to you, nuggets. Let's look at the second method. The second way that you can fix it is to attach the fragment to a brand new sentence. So you create a completely new sentence and then add on the phrase. So here's a phrase, laughing like a hyena. What is a sentence that would make sense with that phrase? I'm creating a new sentence. So I'm just going to say, Jeremy ran down the deserted hallway. And I can use that phrase to describe Jeremy. So I'm going to combine that into a new sentence. Laughing like a hyena, comma, Jeremy ran down the deserted hallway. So you see, I've added this to the beginning of the sentence. I've separated with a comma to show that it depends on what follows, and then I have the new sentence that I created after it. This is a much more sophisticated and descriptive sentence, one that's going to make your writing more interesting. You're going to notice that many of our fixes, if you add a phrase fragment or a subordinate clause fragment to the beginning of a sentence, it's going to be followed by a comma. And last but not least, most of the time you are not going to be fixing phrase fragments in isolation. They're going to be part of a longer paragraph. This is the most common method. This is usually what you're going to be doing when you have one. So here's a very brief snippet of a paragraph. Alyssa went cliff diving this summer, my crazy younger sister. Sometimes I worry that she will get hurt. Well, my phrase fragment here is my crazy younger sister. That's a phrase fragment because it doesn't have a predicate. So I look around my paragraph and I ask myself, well, what sentence that is nearby could I combine it with and I could still express what I'm trying to communicate? Not all sentences are created equal. If I try to combine my crazy younger sister, sometimes I worry that she will get hurt. It doesn't quite make sense that way, so I might choose to combine it with the first sentence. Alyssa went cliff diving this summer. And I could add some commas and create in a positive phrase with my phrase fragment to create a much better improved sentence. So Alyssa, comma, my crazy younger sister, comma, went cliff diving this summer. Now, the thing about combining with sentences is that you have lots of choices. You could fix this in another way. For example, let's say I decided I did want to combine this with sometimes I worry that she will get hurt. How would you do that? Take a minute and see if you can figure it out. Good. What you could do is substitute the phrase for your second pronoun here. So instead of saying, sometimes I worry that she will get hurt, I could say, sometimes I worry that my crazy younger sister will get hurt. See how easy that is? So it allows you to have a lot of variety in your sentence structures when you're writing. Let's practice. I'm going to give you 5 of these on your paper in your notes. Try to fix them using these 3 techniques. Try to use each technique at least once. So number 1 says, about her weekly schedule. Number 2, riding her new bicycle. 3, to fish for rainbow trout. 4, eating breakfast. 5, 2 tests on the same day. Pause this video and hit play whenever you're done to look at some sample answers. Welcome back. All right, now, the samples that I'm about to show you, they're probably totally different than what you have on your paper, but it can be helpful and instructive to see different variations. So an example of a way that you could have corrected number 1, I added a new sentence to the beginning and put the phrase on at the end. So Marlena decided to talk to her boss. So I added a completely new subject and a completely new predicate here. Jaylene was riding her bicycle. Again, I added a new subject and a new predicate. Well, to be technical, I added a new subject and then I also added a helping verb so that my verb tense would make sense. For this one, I created a completely new independent clause and placed the phrase at the beginning and separated it with a comma because it's coming before the sentence. So to fish for rainbow trout, comma, you have to have luck, patience, and skill. Number 4, I inserted the phrase into the middle of my sentence. So it is not set off with commas here because it is the object of the verb love. I'm explaining what I love to do at Bob Evans. So I love eating breakfast at Bob Evans. And number 5, I had 2 tests on the same day. For this one, I added a new subject and a new predicate to fix my sentences. So double check all your sentences. Are they all complete? Did you capitalize and punctuate? If so, good job. Now let's move on and talk about dependent clauses. Again, there are 3 ways to fix a subordinate clause, and you'll notice that they're very similar and that they closely parallel how to fix phrase fragments. The first method is to create a new sentence to complete the thought. Then combine your new sentence with a fragment. So because I was up until 3 a.m., you recognize this subordinate clause fragment from the previous slides. I create a new sentence and add it so that that dependent clause has something to lean on. So the sentence I created was, well, because of fact, what would I do if I was up till 3 a.m.? And I decided I would probably add extra espresso to my morning coffee. So I wrote, I added an extra shot of espresso to my vanilla macchiato just to make it through the day. And then I combine them. And now I have a brand new sentence and I no longer have a fragment. Because I was up until 3 a.m., comma, I added an extra shot of espresso to my vanilla macchiato just to make it through the day. So notice I added the dependent clause to the beginning, so I put a comma because this dependent clause precedes or comes before the independent clause. Notice I could very easily add it to the end. I could very easily say, I added an extra shot of espresso to my vanilla macchiato just to make it through the day because I was up until 3 a.m. If you add the subordinate clause at the end, you will not put a comma before the subordinating conjunction because it's at the end and it's completing the thought. Your second method is like what we just talked about with phrase fragments. You're going to combine the subordinate clause fragment with an existing sentence in a paragraph. That, of course, will make sense. So here's a sample paragraph. This snippet. An old king was dying and he left all he owned to his children, the prince and princess, that the princess wanted. The king, however, left the gold to the prince. Now, this subordinate clause fragment you recognize, but it doesn't make any sense. So I look around, I cast about in the paragraph for a sentence that will make sense. That's the key. You can't just combine it with anything. You want it to flow so your readers don't go, huh, and start scratching their head. So I think that the princess wanted, I think that is meant to refer to the gold, okay, that she wanted the gold that was left to the prince. So I will combine the sentence with the subordinate clause, and my new sentence is here. The king, however, comma, left the gold that the princess wanted to the prince. Notice I added my subordinating conjunction onto the end of the sentence, and that's why there is no comma before my subordinating conjunction. And here's the last method. I strongly caution you not to use this frequently, and you'll see why in a moment. The third method is simple. It's very easy. You can snap your fingers, poof, and have your fragment fixed. All you do is remove the subordinating conjunction and then capitalize. So, for example, when we got to Grandma's house at 8 p.m., if I just delete when and I capitalize we, poof, I have fixed the problem. Here's the issue. For this example, it worked. For other examples, it might not necessarily work. For example, to go back and look at our that the princess wanted. If I just cut off the word that, and I'm left with the princess wanted, that still doesn't express a complete thought because wanted is a type of verb called a transitive verb and it needs an object. So there are multiple problems with it. And I might think that I fixed it and gotten rid of the fragment by deleting that and capitalizing the, but I really haven't. So I really caution you to be careful with rule number 3. Only use it when absolutely necessary. Are you ready to practice? These ones can be a little trickier than phrase fragments, so let's see how you can do on your own. So number 1, after Georgina watered the plants. Number 2, as long as the shelves are dusty. Number 3, if Brady's eyes hurt. Number 4, whenever the ball rebounded. And number 5, while Carol watches one TV show a week. So number 1 through 5 on your paper and your notes, and try this and do the best that you can with commas. Again, we'll cover this in another unit, but try to apply what you've learned briefly today. When you're ready to resume, hit play. You're back. Let's look at some sample corrections. And again, your corrections will not match what is on this screen, but it's always instructive to look at some extra examples. So number 1, for this one, I put a comma at the end and I added a new independent clause. She pruned her bonsai tree, which has a subject, a predicate, and on its own it can stand as an independent clause. So altogether, after Georgina watered the plants, comma, she pruned her bonsai tree. Check on your paper. Did you put yours at the beginning? And if you did you follow it with a comma? Here's another example of keeping the subordinating conjunction at the beginning of the sentence. As long as the shelves are dusty, comma, I can't reshelve the books. Again, I used the same method. I added a new subject, new predicate, and I made sure that it was an independent clause that was added. Now number 3 looks a little bit different. The doctor asked if Brady's eyes hurt. Pardon me, I actually highlighted the wrong part in red. What should be highlighted is if Brady's eyes hurt. Well, if is my subordinating conjunction, and I've added it after the independent clause. So for that reason, there is not a comma before the subordinating conjunction. Remember, it's only when they're at the beginning that you follow with a comma, in most instances. Here's another example of the same method. Only this one, yay, I did the right color. Guess I need an extra cup of coffee this morning, Nuggets. So Tim took charge wherever the ball rebounded. So in this case, I added an independent clause to the beginning again. Tim is my subject. What did he do? He took charge. And I have the subordinating conjunction at the end. No comma because it follows the independent clause. And the last one, while Carol watches one TV show a week, comma, Sandra watches almost every program that airs. So I added a new independent clause. I put the independent clause after the dependent clause. So the dependent clause comes first, so I do follow it with a comma. So double check your paper. How did you do with your commas? Did you capitalize and punctuate? Good. Well, that's it for now, Nuggets. If you still have questions about this, please see me before or after school or send me an email. See you soon. Bye.